The warning beacon flashed red across the bridge of the human ship Dauntless, its urgent signal cutting through the quiet hum of space travel like a scream in the night. Captain Minho stood before the main display screen, watching the pulsing, crimson light that marked one of the most dangerous places in the known galaxy. The beacon's message was clear and direct, transmitted in 17 different galactic languages to ensure no species could claim ignorance of the threat that lay ahead. Kythera 7 hung in space like a frozen jewel of death, its white surface gleaming under the distant light of its parent star. From this distance it looked peaceful, even beautiful, but Minho knew better than to trust appearances in space. The moon had earned its reputation through the blood and bones of countless explorers who had underestimated its lethal nature. According to the galactic records, no living being had ever spent more than 30 minutes on its surface and lived to tell about it. The bridge crew gathered around their captain, each member studying the data streams that flowed across their individual screens. Communications Officer Yuna pulled up the official Galactic Council designation files, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface as she accessed the restricted information that few species were brave enough or foolish enough to request. The classification appeared in bold letters across the main screen, its meaning unmistakable to anyone familiar with galactic safety protocols. Class X Hazard Zone, the designation read, followed by a list of warnings that made seasoned space travelers think twice about even approaching the area. The moon's surface temperature could drop to negative 400 degrees during its 6-hour night cycles, cold enough to freeze most known forms of life solid in seconds. But temperature was just the beginning of Kythera 7's deadly arsenal against those foolish enough to land on its surface. The gravity on the moon was unstable, fluctuating without warning or pattern. Objects that weighed 50 pounds could suddenly find themselves crushed under 500 pounds of gravitational force, or launched into space with less warning than it took to blink. The gravitational anomalies had claimed more ships than enemy fire in 3 separate galactic wars, earning the moon a place in the textbooks as an example of nature's ability to create weapons more terrible than anything designed by intelligent minds. Beneath the frozen surface, massive pockets of compressed methane waited like sleeping giants. When these pockets found release through cracks in the ice, they erupted with the force of nuclear explosions, sending towers of superheated gas and debris miles into the thin atmosphere. The eruptions followed no schedule that scientists could predict, making every step on the surface a gamble with death itself. The ice formations that covered most of the moon's surface had been carved by millions of years of methane explosions and gravitational stress into shapes that resembled massive knives and spears. These crystalline structures were sharp enough to cut through military-grade armor like paper, and strong enough to impale a falling spacecraft. Many rescue missions had ended in tragedy, when would-be heroes found their ships sliced apart by ice formations they never saw coming. The atmosphere of Kythera 7 contained trace amounts of acids that had been crystallized by the extreme cold. When atmospheric storms swept across the surface, these acid crystals rode the winds like microscopic razors, capable of eating through protective suits and exposed skin with equal efficiency. The storms could last for days, trapping anyone caught in the open with no hope of survival until the weather cleared. 17 different species had lost research vessels to the moon's dangers over the past century. The insectoid Vextari had lost 3 ships trying to establish a mining operation. On the surface, each crew found frozen solid in positions that suggested they had been trying to escape some unseen horror. The crystalline Helians had attempted to set up a weather monitoring station, but their installation had been destroyed by a methane eruption before they could gather a single day's worth of data. Even the mighty Zorathians, whose thick hides and natural armor made them nearly invulnerable to most environmental hazards, had declared Kythera 7 off-limits after losing 2 survey teams to the gravitational anomalies. The bodies had been found scattered across several square miles, crushed and torn apart by forces that defied understanding. The Galactic Council had eventually declared the moon a forbidden zone, placing warning beacons throughout the system. To ensure that no species would accidentally stumble into the death trap, ships were required to maintain a minimum distance of 10 million miles from the moon's surface, and any vessel that ignored the warnings would find itself facing serious legal consequences if it somehow managed to survive the encounter. Minho, studied the data with the careful attention of a career military officer who had seen enough dangerous situations to respect them all. The moon's reputation was well earned, and he had no intention of adding his crew to the list of casualties that marked its bloody history. The smart thing to do would be to acknowledge the warning beacon, update their navigation computers to avoid the area, and continue on their mission to the outer colonies. But as he watched his crew work, Minho noticed something that made him pause. Several of his officers were not displaying the appropriate level of concern for the warnings they were receiving. In fact, some of them seemed to be getting more excited as they read through the hazard reports. Communications Officer Yuna was practically bouncing in her seat as she pulled up detailed topographical maps of the moon's surface, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm that seemed completely inappropriate for the situation. Chief Recreation Specialist Taehyun had abandoned his normal duties entirely, instead focusing all his attention on the geological surveys that showed the moon's surface features in incredible detail. He was making notes in his personal tablet, occasionally letting out quiet exclamations of amazement that definitely did not sound like the reactions of someone reading about a place that had killed thousands of explorers. The rest of the crew seemed to be following suit, each member finding something in the hazard reports that captured their interest in ways that Minho found both fascinating and deeply concerning. These were trained professionals who understood the dangers of space exploration better than most. Yet they were reacting to one of the galaxy's most notorious death traps, like children who had just been told they were going to an amusement park. Minho cleared his throat to get their attention, but his crew remained focused on their screens, completely absorbed in whatever they were finding in the official reports about Kythera 7. The captain began to suspect that his crew was planning something that would probably violate several galactic regulations and definitely put them all in mortal danger. Given humanity's reputation for doing exactly those sorts of things, he realized he was probably right to be concerned. The warning beacon continued to flash its urgent message across the bridge, but Minho was beginning to understand that his crew had already made their decision about what they wanted to do next. As he watched Taehyun pull up detailed weather reports about the moon's atmospheric conditions, the captain realized that this mission was about to become much more interesting than he had originally planned. The alien monitoring stations scattered throughout the Kythera system had been watching the human ship with growing confusion for the past 6 hours. The vessel had received the standard warning transmission, acknowledged receipt of the message, and then done something that no other species had ever done in the recorded history of the galaxy. Instead of changing course and fleeing the area like any reasonable civilization would do, the humans had moved closer to the Forbidden Moon and begun what appeared to be detailed preparation for a surface landing. Commander Klixth of the Vextari monitoring station rubbed his compound eyes with one of his secondary arms, certain that his translation equipment must be malfunctioning. The intercepted communications from the human ship were filled with terms that made no sense when applied to a Class X hazard zone. The humans were discussing powder conditions, terrain features, and something called runtimes in voices filled with excitement, rather than the terror that any sane species would feel when contemplating a visit to the surface of Kythera 7. Hi. Crystallark Vexinari of the Helion observation post was experiencing similar difficulties understanding the human behavior. Her crystalline form resonated with harmonics of confusion as she listened to the humans plan what they were calling an expedition to the Death Moon. The frequencies of their voices suggested anticipation and joy, emotions that seemed completely inappropriate for beings who were apparently planning to commit elaborate suicide. Aboard the Dauntless, Chief Engineer Jinwoo had taken over the main fabrication bay and turned it into what he called his workshop. The normally orderly space was now filled with strips of reinforced carbon fiber, magnetic binding systems, and various pieces of equipment that bore no resemblance to standard exploration gear. Jinwoo worked with the focused intensity of an artist creating his masterpiece, carefully shaping each piece of material according to designs that he claimed would revolutionize their approach to surface exploration. The objects he was creating looked like nothing the alien observers had ever seen before. Long, narrow strips of composite material with curved tips and strange bindings that seemed designed to attach to human feet. When asked to explain what he was building, Jinwoo had simply grinned and said they were snowboards, as if that term explained everything. The alien monitoring stations immediately began searching their databases for any reference to these mysterious devices, finding nothing that helped them understand what the humans were planning to do. Atmospheric specialist Nari had claimed the navigation center for her own purposes, surrounding herself with detailed weather reports, geological surveys, and eruption pattern analyses that covered every surface within reach. She was treating the methane geysers that had destroyed 17 ships as if they were simply another weather phenomenon to be planned around, calculating what she called optimal run times between eruptions with the casual efficiency of someone planning a picnic. The aliens watched in horror as Nari marked locations on the surface maps where the most violent eruptions had been recorded, noting these spots not as areas to avoid, but as what she termed natural features that could be incorporated into their activities. When Commander Clixith transmitted a direct warning about the deadly nature of methane explosions, Nari had responded by thanking him for the information and asking if he had any data on wind patterns during eruption events. Medical Officer Hyunwoo had begun preparing trauma treatment kits with an enthusiasm that suggested he expected his services to be needed frequently during their visit to the moon. However, instead of packing the standard emergency medical supplies that would be appropriate for life-threatening injuries, he was focusing on equipment for treating what he called epic wipeouts. The aliens could not find any translation for this term in their databases, but the context suggested it involved some form of controlled collision with the environment. The alien observers found themselves caught between fascination and terror as they watched the human preparations continue. Every piece of equipment being modified, every plan being made, every conversation being held, seemed designed to increase, rather than decrease the dangers the humans would face on the surface. It was as if the entire crew had decided that Kithara 7 was not dangerous enough in its natural state, and was actively working to make their experience more hazardous. Captain Minho had tried to maintain some semblance of normal command structure during the preparation phase, but it quickly became apparent that his crew had collectively decided to interpret their mission parameters in ways that would have caused most military commanders to declare mutiny. When he attempted to discuss standard safety protocols for hazardous environment exploration, recreation specialist Taehyun had presented him with detailed plans for what he called the sickest terrain park in the galaxy. The term terrain park was another mystery that sent the alien observers scrambling through their databases. The closest translation they could find suggested some form of recreational facility, but this made even less sense when applied to a moon that had killed every explorer who had ever set foot on its surface. The idea that any species would visit Kythera 7 for recreational purposes was so alien to their understanding of survival instincts that several monitoring stations requested emergency consultations with their respective governments. Communications. Officer Yuna had abandoned all pretense of maintaining proper military communications protocols and was instead focused on what she called documenting the adventure for social media. She was setting up recording equipment with the stated goal of capturing what she termed the sickness for transmission back to human space. The aliens were becoming increasingly concerned that the humans might be suffering from some form of collective mental illness that caused them to seek out dangerous situations for entertainment. Mission psychologist Soyeon was perhaps the most disturbing human to observe, as she seemed to be the only crew member who understood exactly how dangerous their planned activities were. Yet she was also the most enthusiastic about proceeding. When directly questioned about human psychological responses to extreme danger, she had explained that her species had developed something called extreme sports, which involved deliberately seeking out life-threatening situations for the purpose of recreation and personal satisfaction. The alien observers immediately assumed this was some form of translation error, as the concept of deliberately seeking danger for enjoyment seemed to violate every known principle of evolutionary biology. Species that actively pursued death-dealing situations should have eliminated themselves from the gene pool millions of years ago. Yet humans had somehow managed to develop space travel while maintaining what appeared to be a species-wide death wish. Commander Clixth transmitted increasingly frantic warnings to the human ship, explaining in detail the fate that had befallen every previous expedition to Kythara 7. He described the frozen corpses of Vextari miners, the shattered remains of Helion researchers, and the scattered body parts of Zorathian survey teams. Each warning was acknowledged politely by the humans, who thanked him for the information and asked if he had any recommendations for the best landing sites. High Crystallarch Vexnari attempted a different approach, transmitting mathematical proofs that demonstrated the statistical impossibility of surviving more than 30 minutes on the moon's surface. The humans responded by asking if she had any data on how the gravitational anomalies might affect their equipment performance, treating forces that could crush a battleship as if they were minor environmental factors to be incorporated into their planning. As the human preparations entered their final phase, the alien monitoring stations found themselves in the unprecedented position of watching a species deliberately and methodically prepare to commit what appeared to be elaborate group suicide. The humans showed no signs of fear, regret, or even basic caution as they loaded their modified equipment into landing craft and began final systems checks for surface deployment. The moment the human landing craft separated from the Dauntless and began its descent toward Kythera 7, every alien monitoring station in the system fell completely silent. Across 17 different species and 43 separate observation posts, not a single word was transmitted as billions of beings watched what they were certain would be the final moments of another doomed expedition to the galaxy's most notorious death trap. Commander Clixith had positioned his entire staff around the main viewing screen in their monitoring station, each Vextari present convinced they were about to witness a tragedy that would be remembered for generations. The compound eyes of his species were perfectly adapted for observing fine details across vast distances, which meant they would see everything that happened to the humans in crystal-clear resolution. Several junior officers had requested permission to leave the observation deck, unable to bear the thought of watching another species meet its end on the frozen surface below. High Crystallarch Vexenari had synchronized her consciousness with the primary observation crystals of her station, allowing her to experience the incoming data streams with perfect clarity. The harmonic frequencies that normally flowed through her crystalline form had shifted to the deep, mournful tones that her species reserved for funeral ceremonies. She had witnessed the destruction of her own people's research expedition to Kythera 7, and the memory of their final transmissions still resonated through her being like an eternal song of grief. The human landing craft descended through the thin atmosphere of Kythera 7 with what appeared to be reckless speed, its pilot making no attempt to slow the approach or find a safe landing zone. The vessel touched down in an area where 3 different methane geysers had erupted within the past galactic standard week, scattering debris and razor-sharp ice fragments across several square miles of surface. It was exactly the sort of location that any reasonable species would avoid at all costs, yet the humans had chosen it deliberately. For several long minutes after landing, nothing happened. The alien observers began to hope that perhaps the humans had finally come to their senses and decided to remain safely inside their protective craft. The landing vehicle sat motionless on the frozen surface, its hull gleaming under the pale light of the distant star, while methane vapor drifted past like ghostly fingers, reaching out from the depths of the moon. Then the airlock opened. Captain Minyo emerged first, stepping onto the surface of Kythera 7, as if he were taking a casual stroll through a peaceful garden. He was followed immediately by recreation specialist Taehyun, who took one look around at the crystalline landscape and let out a sound that the alien observer's translation equipment rendered as a cry of pure joy. The 2 humans stood on the frozen ground for a moment, apparently admiring the view of towering ice spires and scattered methane vents that had killed so many explorers before them. The alien monitoring stations buzzed with confused communication traffic as observers tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The humans were not moving with the careful, fearful steps of beings who understood they were walking through a minefield of death. Instead, they were behaving like tourists who had just arrived at the most beautiful destination in the galaxy. Taehyun was actually pointing at various surface features with obvious excitement, as if he were planning to visit each dangerous location personally. Communications Officer Yuna emerged from the landing craft next, carrying recording equipment that she immediately began setting up around the landing site. The devices were clearly not scientific instruments designed to study the moon's deadly properties, but rather entertainment technology meant to capture what she kept calling action footage. She positioned cameras at multiple angles around what appeared to be a large slope of frozen methane and ice crystals, treating the formation like a natural amphitheater rather than a geological hazard. Engineer Jinwoo appeared, carrying the strange, composite devices he had been constructing during the journey, the mysterious objects he called snowboards. In the low gravity and harsh lighting of Kythera 7, the alien observers could see that these devices were clearly designed to be attached to human feet. Though their purpose remained completely incomprehensible, the smooth, curved surfaces gleamed with an almost mirror-like finish that seemed to be designed for sliding rather than walking. When atmospheric specialist Nari joined the group on the surface, she was carrying what appeared to be a handheld sensor device that she used to test the consistency of the frozen methane deposits. Instead of checking for dangerous chemical concentrations or structural instability, she seemed to be evaluating the material's suitability for some unknown purpose. Her readings apparently satisfied her, because she nodded approvingly and announced that the powder conditions were absolutely perfect. The alien observers were beginning to suspect that they were witnessing some form of elaborate ritual preparation, possibly a ceremonial form of group suicide that was unique to human culture. This theory seemed to gain support when Medical Officer Hyunwoo emerged from the craft carrying what appeared to be celebratory beverages rather than emergency medical equipment. The steaming containers suggested hot liquid refreshments, as if the humans were planning to have a party on the surface of the most dangerous moon in known space. Mission psychologist Soyeon was the last to exit the landing craft, and her behavior was perhaps the most disturbing of all. She stood on the frozen surface for a long moment, looking around at the lethal landscape with an expression that the aliens could only interpret as deep satisfaction. When she finally spoke, her words were transmitted clearly to every monitoring station in the system, and their meaning sent waves of shock through the observer crews. She announced that the psychological benefits of extreme environmental challenges were exactly what the crew needed to maintain optimal mental health during their long journey through space. The humans were not planning to commit suicide on Kythera 7. They were planning to use the deadly moon as some form of therapeutic recreation facility. The concept was so alien to every known form of intelligent behavior that several monitoring stations requested immediate backup from their home governments, certain that they were witnessing the actions of a species that had completely lost touch with reality. The first human to actually interact with the environment was Jinwoo, who attached one of his mysterious snowboard devices to his feet and pushed himself forward onto a gentle slope of frozen methane. The alien observers watched in horrified fascination as he slid smoothly down the incline, apparently using the composite device to glide across the surface that had been formed by one of the moon's deadly geological processes. Instead of being killed instantly by hidden dangers, he seemed to be enjoying the experience immensely. When Jinwoo reached the bottom of the slope, he let out another cry of joy and immediately began climbing back up for what appeared to be a second attempt. The alien observers were beginning to realize that the strange devices were actually designed to allow humans to slide deliberately down the dangerous slopes of Kythera 7, treating the moon's lethal terrain as some form of entertainment facility. Tae-hyun was next to try the sliding activity, choosing a much steeper slope that ended near a cluster of razor-sharp ice formations. The aliens expected to see him impaled within seconds, but instead watched as he navigated between the deadly obstacles with casual skill, apparently treating the life-threatening hazards as nothing more than interesting challenges to be overcome. For the sake of amusement, the human behavior was becoming more inexplicable by the minute, and the alien observers found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about survival instincts, intelligence, and the basic principles of self-preservation that governed all known forms of life. What happened next on the surface of Kythera 7 would be recorded in the histories of 17 different alien civilizations as the day that every known law of survival and self-preservation was shattered by a single species' incomprehensible approach to recreation. The alien monitoring stations had been prepared to document another tragic loss of life to the moon's lethal environment, but instead found themselves witnessing events that challenged their fundamental understanding of what intelligent life should consider entertaining. Atmospheric specialist Nari was the first human to encounter one of Kythera 7's most notorious hazards in a way that defied every prediction the observers had made. She had positioned herself at the top of a slope that led directly over a field of gravitational anomalies, areas where previous expeditions had been crushed or launched into space without warning. The monitoring stations detected the gravitational fluctuations beginning to intensify as she prepared to descend, and every observer expected to watch her be torn apart by forces that could crumple starship hulls. Instead, Nari launched herself down the slope with obvious enthusiasm, using her snowboard to ride the changing gravitational fields like waves in an ocean. When the gravity suddenly increased to 10 times normal levels, she crouched low and used the additional force to increase her speed, rather than being crushed by it. When the field reversed and tried to launch her into space, she used the reduced gravity to perform aerial maneuvers that should have been physically impossible for a human being. The alien observers watched in stunned silence as she treated the gravitational anomalies not as deadly traps, but as natural features that enhanced her sliding experience. She navigated through the field with the casual skill of someone who had been dealing with variable gravity fields her entire life, using each fluctuation to perform what she later described as the most radical airtime she had ever experienced. Communications. Officer Yuna was capturing every moment of the impossible display on her recording equipment, providing commentary that the alien translation systems could barely process. She described Nari's navigation of the gravity field as totally sick and absolutely legendary, terms that seemed to indicate extreme approval rather than the horror that any reasonable being should feel when watching someone dance with forces that could atomize a living creature in milliseconds. Medical Officer Hyunwoo had chosen an even more challenging route for his descent, selecting a path that would take him directly through an area where methane geysers had been detected building pressure beneath the surface. The seismic sensors in the alien monitoring stations were already detecting the preliminary tremors that indicated an imminent eruption, warning signs that should have sent any intelligent being fleeing in the opposite direction as quickly as possible. When the first geyser exploded directly beneath his path, sending a column of superheated methane and debris hundreds of feet into the thin atmosphere, Hyunwoo did something that caused several alien observers to question whether their equipment was malfunctioning. Instead of being vaporized by the eruption, he used the explosive force as a launch mechanism, riding the shockwave to gain altitude while performing what Yuna's commentary identified as a perfect backflip with a methane boost. The alien monitoring crews began frantically checking their sensor readings, certain that their instruments must be providing false information. No organic life form could survive direct exposure to a methane geyser eruption, yet they were clearly watching a human being use such an eruption as a recreational enhancement to his sliding activities. The contradiction between what they were seeing and what they knew to be possible was causing stress reactions throughout the observation stations. High crystallarch Vexnari's crystalline form began developing hairline fractures as her consciousness struggled to process the visual data being transmitted from the surface of Kythera 7. Her species' understanding of physics and biology simply could not accommodate the possibility that any being could treat methane explosions as sources of entertainment rather than immediate death threats. Mission psychologist Soyeon had taken a different approach to interacting with the moon's deadly environment, choosing to descend a slope that would take her directly through one of the acidic atmospheric storms that periodically swept across the surface. The crystallized acid particles in the storm were capable of eating through military-grade protective equipment in minutes, yet she entered the swirling cloud of death with the same enthusiasm her crewmates had shown for the other hazards. The alien observers lost visual contact with her as she disappeared into the storm, and for several minutes they hoped that perhaps the laws of chemistry would finally claim one of the humans. The acidic crystals should have dissolved her protective suit and consumed her living tissue within moments of contact, providing at least some evidence that the universe still operated according to predictable principles. When Soyeon emerged from the other side of the storm, not only was she completely unharmed, but she was actually praising the experience as refreshingly therapeutic. She announced to her crewmates that the storm had provided exactly the kind of sensory challenge she needed to evaluate the psychological benefits of extreme environmental exposure, and that she was already planning to recommend similar activities for future missions. Even more disturbing was her observation that the acidic particles in the storm had actually improved the performance of her snowboard, creating what she described as the smoothest glide surface she had ever experienced. She was treating corrosive chemicals that could dissolve living tissue as a natural equipment enhancement, as if Cathera 7's deadly atmosphere was some form of cosmic maintenance facility designed to optimize human recreational equipment. Engineer Jinwoo had been observing the activities of his crewmates while working on modifications to his own equipment, apparently inspired by the environmental challenges to create even more elaborate ways to interact with the moon's hazards. He produced additional devices from his pack, strange contraptions that appeared to be designed to increase rather than decrease the dangers he would face during his descent. When he finally began his own run down the surface of Cathera 7, he had equipped himself with what appeared to be additional wings or sails that caught the toxic atmospheric winds and used them to achieve even greater speeds than should have been possible. He was deliberately using every deadly feature of the moon's environment to enhance his recreational experience, treating radiation, acid storms, gravity fluctuations, and methane explosions as natural amenities rather than existential threats. The alien observers found themselves caught in a psychological crisis as they watched the humans continue to not only survive their encounters with Cathera 7's hazards, but actually seemed to be enjoying themselves more with each passing moment. Recreation specialist Taehyun was already making plans for what he called a permanent installation on the moon, sketching designs for structures that would allow other humans to visit and experience what he described as the ultimate winter sports destination. Captain Minho stood at the landing site, coordinating his crew's activities with the calm professionalism of someone managing a routine training exercise, rather than a desperate fight for survival on the galaxy's most dangerous world. He was taking notes on the various techniques his crew members were developing, apparently planning to incorporate their discoveries into official human recreational protocols. The alien monitoring stations had fallen into complete silence as they watched the impossible continue to unfold before their sensors, their crews struggling to comprehend how an entire species could have evolved to treat mortal danger as a form of entertainment that improved with increased lethality. 6 hours had passed since the humans had landed on Cathera 7, and the alien observers throughout the system were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about intelligence, survival, and the basic principles that governed life in the universe. The humans had not only survived their encounter with the galaxy's most notorious death trap, they had somehow transformed it into what they kept calling the most epic recreational experience in known space. As the moon's deadly night cycle approached, bringing temperatures that would drop to negative 400 degrees and atmospheric conditions that would kill most life forms in seconds, the alien monitoring stations prepared to finally witness the limits of human endurance. Surely even these incomprehensible beings would recognize the need to evacuate before the night brought hazards that exceeded even their bizarre tolerance for mortal danger. Commander Clixith had spent the past several hours in consultation with the finest military strategists and xenobiologists in Vexitari space, desperately seeking some explanation for what his station had observed. The compound eyes of his species had recorded every detail of the human activities in perfect clarity, yet none of his advisors could provide any rational explanation for how the humans had not only survived, but thrived in conditions that had destroyed 17 previous expeditions. The official reports from his station described humans using methane explosions as launch mechanisms, navigating gravitational anomalies as if they were natural playground equipment, and treating acid storms as equipment maintenance facilities. When he transmitted these reports to his superiors, the response had been an immediate demand for complete sensor diagnostics and psychological evaluation of his entire crew, as the High Command refused to believe that any species could behave in such a manner. High Crystallarch Vexinari had synchronized her consciousness with observation crystals throughout the Helion network, sharing the impossible visual data with millions of her people across dozens of star systems. The harmonic frequencies that carried information through her species' collective consciousness had shifted from funeral dirges to something that had no name in their language, a resonance pattern that expressed complete bewilderment at events that transcended their understanding of reality. The crystalline archives of her people contained detailed records of every known species' behavior patterns when confronted with extreme environmental hazards, yet nothing in their vast database of knowledge could explain how humans had managed to treat Kythera 7's lethal features as recreational amenities. Several of her fellow crystal arcs had begun developing structural fractures from the cognitive strain of trying to process information that contradicted everything they believed about the nature of intelligent life. As the night cycle began, and the temperature started its deadly plunge toward absolute zero, the alien observers expected to see the humans finally acknowledge the limits of their inexplicable abilities and retreat to the safety of their landing craft. Instead, they watched in growing horror as atmospheric specialist Nari announced over the communication channels that the approaching darkness would create perfect conditions for what she called a night run. The bioluminescent properties of Kythera 7's ice formations were activated by the extreme temperature changes that occurred during the transition to night, causing the crystalline structures to glow with an eerie blue-green light that would have been beautiful if it were not associated with conditions that meant instant death for most organic life. Nari was describing this deadly phenomenon as a lighting enhancement that would make their recreational activities even more visually spectacular. Medical Officer Hyunwoo had begun setting up what appeared to be a permanent campsite near the landing zone, using controlled methane ignition to create heating sources for what the humans were calling a camping experience. The idea of voluntarily remaining on the surface of Kythera 7 during the night cycle was so far beyond the comprehension of the alien observers that several monitoring stations requested immediate relief crews, as their current personnel were beginning to show signs of psychological breakdown from witnessing the impossible. The humans were not only planning to remain on the surface during the night, they were actually looking forward to the experience as if it were some form of enhanced entertainment opportunity. Recreation specialist Taehyun was already planning routes down slopes that would only be visible during the bioluminescent display, treating the deadly night conditions as a special effect that would improve his recreational experience rather than a threat that could kill him in minutes. Engineer Jinwoo had spent the final hours of daylight working on additional modifications to the equipment, apparently inspired by the approaching night to create even more elaborate methods of interacting with the moon's hazards. His latest creations included devices that seemed designed to harness the bioluminescent energy of the ice formations, possibly to power additional recreational enhancements that would allow the humans to engage with dangers that did not even exist during the day. The alien observers watched in fascinated horror as the humans began their night activities with the same enthusiasm they had shown during the day. Nari launched herself down a slope that glowed with deadly bioluminescent light, using the eerie illumination to navigate between ice formations that could slice through starship hulls. She moved through the ghostly landscape like a dancer performing for an audience of death itself, treating the lethal beauty of the night cycle as the perfect backdrop for her recreational activities. Captain Minho stood near the landing craft, coordinating his crew's nighttime adventures while maintaining communication with the alien monitoring stations. He transmitted a message that would be remembered throughout galactic history as the moment when humanity officially announced its complete disconnection from any reasonable definition of self-preservation. He thanked the Galactic Council for their warning about Kythera 7, describing it as the most accurate recreational destination review he had ever received. The captain's message praised every deadly feature of the moon as if they were carefully designed amenities at a luxury resort. He rated the gravity fluctuations as excellent for aerial maneuvers, the methane geysers as perfect for altitude enhancement, and the acid storms as surprisingly effective for equipment maintenance. His tone throughout the transmission was that of a satisfied customer leaving a positive review for a service that had exceeded all expectations. The most disturbing part of his message was the final request that caused emergency sessions to be called in 17 different galactic governments. Captain Minho asked the Council to provide coordinates for any other Class X hazard zones in known space, explaining that his crew was always looking for new locations that would provide similar recreational opportunities. He specifically mentioned that they were planning to bring families on future expeditions, as the natural hazards would provide excellent training opportunities for human children. The alien response to this transmission was immediate panic across multiple star systems. The idea of humans deliberately seeking out additional death worlds for recreational purposes was terrifying enough. But the suggestion that they wanted to bring their offspring to such places violated every principle of species preservation that governed civilized society. Several governments immediately began emergency reviews of their hazard zone classifications, fearful that humans might interpret their warnings as vacation recommendations. Mission psychologist Soyan added her own transmission to the galactic communication networks, broadcasting on frequencies that reached every inhabited star system within 50 light-years of their position. She announced that the psychological benefits of extreme environmental challenges had exceeded all her expectations, and that she was developing new therapeutic protocols based on their experiences on Kythera 7. Her enthusiasm for what she called controlled exposure to mortal danger as a treatment for stress and anxiety caused several alien mental health organizations to request immediate consultations with their own psychologists. Communications Officer Yuna had been documenting the entire experience with her recording equipment, and as the night activities reached their peak, she began broadcasting live footage to entertainment networks throughout human space. Her commentary described the bioluminescent ice formations as totally sick, and the nighttime snowboarding conditions as absolutely legendary, terms that the alien translation systems rendered as expressions of extreme approval rather than appropriate fear. The live broadcast showed humans gliding through landscapes that looked like frozen hellscapes from the nightmares of every known species. Yet the participants were clearly having the time of their lives. Yuna's footage captured Jinwoo performing aerial maneuvers through clouds of toxic gas that should have dissolved his protective equipment, while Taehyun used gravitational anomalies to achieve speeds that should have torn a human body apart. The night progressed and the temperatures continued to drop toward levels that would kill most life forms instantly. The humans began discussing plans for the following day. They were not content to simply repeat their initial activities, but were already planning more elaborate ways to interact with the moon's deadly environment.